South Africa used to be a role model for a diverse and thriving rainbow nation, where everyone, regardless of race, could live in peace and harmony next to each other. Yet one thing could be observed in recent decades: the country is dying.
Western Cape law enforcement authorities are on high alert following a rise in gang activity and gun violence in recent weeks.
7 of the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in South Africa are in Cape Town. The suburb of Nyanga, which is next door to Manenberg, has the highest murder rate in the country. It registered over 300 murders in the past year.
It's going to take a lot to change their minds about foreigners in South Africa. All these men are out of work, and they put that down to the outsiders who sell their goods and their labour much more cheaply.
People, they work for 80 rand a day, 90 rand a day. It's fine for them because when you go to his country, it's a lot of money. But for us, it's too small. So we are no longer getting jobs anymore because of the salary we're looking for.
The economy is going down, the crime rate is going up, and racial division and hatred are, what it seems, beyond repairable.
This is our land. Don't listen to any elderly person who tells you how you must treat white people.
South Africa has always been under strain, but in recent decades it could be observed that the nation is on an ongoing downward spiral. It is about to collapse.
To the victory of our people, the revolution in South Africa is guaranteed.
The region that we know today as South Africa has always been extremely contested. Before Europeans discovered and colonized the region, countless tribes like the Bantu, the Xhosa, the Zulu or the Khoisan have been fighting and displacing each other. When the Dutch settled in the 17th century, they were also met with hostilities, but prevailed and expanded against the natives. The lucrative trading outposts brought all kinds of travelers to the colony. As wars and desperation swept through Europe, countless people came in search of a new beginning. The end of the 30 Years' War in Europe brought soldiers and farmers into service for the lands of the Dutch East India Company. After the British acquisition, settlers from the UK migrated and brought the English language. The age of expansionism would rearrange the continent once again. One of those movements was the Free Burger or the Boer, descendants of mostly Dutch settlers who went up north to escape from the overbearing British administration and thus start the Great Trek. The expansion was far from peaceful. Countless tribes were either subjugated or expelled. The free men became so numerous and powerful that they were able to establish their independent Boer republics and managed to stand their ground against the British in 2 wars. They would maintain their independence in the First War, but in the second incursion, after an utmost brutal campaign against the locals, they would lose their independence. In 1910, after long negotiations, the Union of South Africa would emerge and unite the 4 colonies under a single entity peacefully. The Union in turn would vote to secede from the British Empire in 1960 and thus decide its own fate as the Republic of South Africa. The hostilities among the settlers with their slaves and the native tribes has always played a significant role in South Africa, and thus it wasn't too surprising when apartheid was introduced by the white minority government. Apartheid translates as separateness and was widely called a series of laws of racial segregation that existed from 1948 till 1990 in South Africa and Southwest Africa. These laws defined the life between the ethnicities, public facilities, social events, housing, employment, and even intimacy. In 1949, it was illegal for whites to have intercourse with a different race other than their own. This was followed by the Registration Act in 1950 that classified all South Africans into 4 subcategories, based on appearance, known ancestry, socioeconomic status, and cultural lifestyle. It was either black, white, colored, or Indian. The latter 2 were also divided again into several subclassifications. In 1955, this idea expanded into the so-called Bantustans, a territory set aside for the Bantu and other black ethnicities, with the aim to leave them into independence. As a result of the apartheid legislation, 3.5 million black Africans were removed from their homes and forced into segregated neighborhoods between 1954 and 1983, in some of the largest mass evictions in modern-day history. These new states would lose their South African citizenship as well as their voting rights, but in reality the Bantustans remained highly corrupt and thus also poor with little to no opportunity, which was largely the fault of the Bantu governments. The Bantustans also had to be kept afloat with subsidies from the white government, in order not to end up as a failed state. Of course, not everybody was on par with those radical ideas, and soon national and international opposition would form against apartheid. At the forefront of the fight against segregation was the African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela. It has been a far cry until the abolition of the apartheid in 1990. It was full of blood, sweat and tears. Nelson Mandela is certainly a very difficult man. While he is widely seen as a peaceful initiator against the apartheid and the founding father of the Rainbow Nation, where blacks, whites, coloreds and Asians can live in reconciliation next to each other, which is certainly not wrong. But unbeknownst to most of us, he also had a very violent and dark side. A more critical approach to his life reveals that he just wasn't a benevolent man with his own flaws. Mandela, and especially his second wife, Winnie, can be attributed to a questionable escalation of the conflict. Their violence wasn't always against the oppressive apartheid regime. Most of their victims were actually innocent civilians, and the majority was actually black. Winnie Mandela was even more notorious for her pursuit of alleged collaborators and spies. Her favorite kind of torture was necklacing. And no, I'm not going to explain this one to you.
Paraffin is easy to catch fire, it's flammable. If I put it on the tire is what? It's catching fire.
And you'll put this on the person.
And while we are beating you, you are very weak. You can't fight back. Even though even I can take this tire, and took it to you like this, you are very weak.
I guess the Mandelas are true to the proverb, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. On the 21st of March 1960, more than 10,000 black South Africans gathered in front of a police department in the Sharpeville township, an underdeveloped, racially segregated part on the outskirts of Johannesburg. The occasion was the introduction of a passport system, which required all black citizens over the age of 16 to carry a book with an identification card, employment details and influx of authorization from a labor bureau. Those laws aimed to limit the stream of non-whites into wealthier and whiter neighborhoods of South African cities. The protest in Sharpeville was peaceful at first, but soon the gathering turned ugly when more than 20,000 people stood in front of 20 policemen. After the arrival of 4 Saracen APCs, 130 policemen and even F-84 Sabre jets, the situation began to escalate. The aircraft tried to scatter the crowd by flying low over the ground, but only provoked a negative response. The crowd threw stones and stormed the barricades. 3 policemen were injured, tear gas was fired, and an arrest was attempted, but the crowd covered the assailant. Then the shooting began. 69 people were killed and 180 were injured. A police report stated that young and inexperienced police officers panicked and opened fire spontaneously, setting off a chain reaction that lasted about 40 seconds. The police were likely quick to fire, as 2 months before the massacre, 9 constables had been assaulted and killed, some disemboweled during a raid at Cantomanor. Few of the policemen present had received public order training. Some of them had been on duty for over 24 hours without respite. The uproar among South Africa's black population was immediate, and the following week saw demonstrations, protest marches, strikes and riots around the country. 1 week later, the government declared a state of emergency and detained more than 18,000 people, including prominent anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela. The incident made international headlines that caused demonstrations in many countries and a condemnation by the United Nations. Sharpeville marked a turning point in South Africa's history. The government found itself increasingly isolated in the international community. The Sharpeville massacre was one of the catalysts for the black population from passive resistance to active and armed rebellion. Among others, Umkhonto we Sizwe was founded, the terrorist wing of the ANC, that caused decades of bombings, kidnapping, torture and murders. Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of a Nation, was founded and led by none other than Nelson Mandela himself. It also received support from the South African Communist Party in its fight against apartheid. Mandela was the leader until he was arrested in '62, but his organization and his second wife continued the campaign until his release in 1990. On the morning of the 16th of June 1976, black students in schools of the Soweto township, Johannesburg, received the announcement that they had to learn Afrikaans as a second language. Understandably, they were not very keen on learning the language that they had associated with apartheid and discrimination. Most blacks either used English or indigenous African languages as a form of communication. Between 10 to 20,000 students walked from their schools to rally at the stadium to march through the township of Orlando. So far, they've made it peacefully to Orlando High School without any visible threat. The police set their K9 on the protesters, who responded by killing it. The police then began to shoot directly at the children. By the end of the day, at least 176 up to 700 children were killed, some as young as 12. Over 1,000 were wounded. The city's emergency clinics were flooded with injured and bleeding children, and the events burned into the memories of the black community. The veto created national and international outrage. For weeks to come, the apartheid government was faced with backlash from all sides. Of course, not always peaceful. The state could never restore the relative peace and social stability of the early 1970s, as black resistance grew. Liberation movements like the ANC or Umkhonto we Sizwe, that were either weakened or exiled, gained new momentum as a surge of recruits joined the parties. As national and international resistance mounted, South Africa realized that the apartheid system could only be maintained through more and more force. The 90s became a decade of changes for South Africa. Mandela was released from prison, and the government began to negotiate an agreement for the dissolution of the apartheid with the previously banned ANC and other opposition parties. On the 18th of November 1993, the apartheid was officially dissolved, and the first equal democratic elections brought Nelson Mandela to power. A rebel but also a communist, and someone who seemingly heralded the end of one chapter and started a new one. Yet no one expected Mandela and the ANC to be worse in many ways than the whites and the apartheid. Shortly before the first elections, thousands of Inkatha Freedom Party supporters marched on the ANC headquarters on Plain Street in Johannesburg on March 28, 1994. An ANC militia gave the order to repel the demonstrators, killing 8 and injuring 84. In June 1995, the ANC and then President Nelson Mandela claimed that he had given the order to defend the headquarters even if it required killing people. The incident was almost foreshadowing the rapid decline and the new era of a South African society. A new era of violence, corruption and, believe it or not, racism was introduced into daily life. Since the white minority lost their power, we also lost a significant amount of their protection. And instead of reconciliation, hate turned towards those that were considered the first conquerors. We white farmers and their descendants were even despised by Mandela himself. His words would lay the foundation for the brutal attacks on white farmers for which South Africa would become notorious. Many of these killings have been unbelievably gruesome, but in the past couple of years, equality has been found in this sector, since black farmers also have been targeted more frequently. Aside from the brutality, how are you going to feed the population if you literally bite the hand that feeds you? Zimbabwe has gone down that road, and Zimbabwe relied on international funds, mostly from white countries, to avoid mass starvation. South Africa used to be the country where the first heart transplant took place, but in mere decades we went from the first to the third world, where the most basic things like electricity or security couldn't be guaranteed. South Africa's currency, the rand, has fallen about 70% since the ANC came to power. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the average income of all races in South Africa dropped 40% between 1995 and 2000. But that's just the beginning. The people rated the government less trustworthy, more corrupt, less able to enforce the law and deliver governmental services. Out of 180 countries, South Africa went down from number 74 to 109 in the Human Development Index since 1990, which means that the quality of life has gone down significantly. Crime is on a new high. Everything from homicides, gang violence to sexual assaults went up significantly. South Africa is considered to be the capital of the world. In a survey, 1 of 3 women turned out to be forced into intercourse, yet the bottom is still not reached. Perhaps that was the vision when Mandela said that under a Communist Party government, South Africa will become a land of milk and honey. Political, economic and social rights will cease to be enjoyed by whites only. They will be shared equally by whites and non-whites. There will be enough land and houses for all. There will be no unemployment, starvation and disease. Workers will earn a decent wage, transport will be cheap and education free. Somehow, none of it materialized. Under these circumstances, it is no wonder that people are leaving in droves, and we are not talking about the worst. The country is experiencing a brain drain of unparalleled proportions. Between 2010 and 2015, more than 128,000 people left the country, mostly the white and educated population. Ironically, it was also the white population that benefited the most from the end of apartheid in terms of income. I mean, if you're constantly threatened with being attacked or worse, if you experience power outages for up to 10 hours a day, And if you have to pay an extra fee just to get an appointment with a government organization, why bother starting a business at all? According to the South African Reserve Bank, the power shortages is costing the country at least 2% of its GDP, that is about $10 billion. And all this happened after the international sanctions against South Africa were lifted in 1996. It is so bad that even some blacks remember the good old days and aspects of the apartheid, where everyone at least had a job and could sustain a decent lifestyle. And before you judge me, it was their words, not mine. Now they all struggle, regardless of race. South Africa is still a beautiful and very promising country. It is full of mineral resources, fertile soils and covered in a wonderful nature. But currently it knows only one way, and that is down. But things can be different when people pull together and take on the task of building a prosperous nation, can be seen in the example of Tanzania. But until then, South Africa really needs to put aside its differences and grow beyond the past. Alright guys, that's it again for the video. I hope you enjoyed my small presentation about South Africa and the end of the apartheid. This is, as some of you probably already noticed, an English version of my video. If you're interested in the German version, you're more than welcome to check it out, link in the description below. And maybe practice your language skills. German subtitles are included. As always, let me know if I forgot something in the comments. And if you want to support my work, leave a like and a sub, because those documentaries are not necessarily done in just one weekend. They take a lot of time and effort. I hope you have a good day and maybe I'm going to see you next time. Bye.